In the 11th century BCE, the nation of Syria would often attack Israel, capturing many and making many their slaves, even children. Notice how the Bible describes one of these raids at 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, and in verse 1, we are told that Naaman was the army chief of the Syrians. He was a mighty warrior, but he was also very sick with leprosy. But notice verse 2. On one of their raids, the Syrians had taken captive from the land of Israel a little girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. Can you picture this little girl being ripped away from her parents? It was frightening for her. She was taken to a strange land with people that were intimidating, and they worshiped many false gods. In that very difficult circumstance, how was this little girl required to exercise strong faith? Please note the answer to this question in the following video.
I remember the day the soldiers took me away. I had never felt more alone. My home, my friends, everything I knew was gone. But I still had Jehovah. The master of the house was very sick. He was in pain. Elisha could help him. I had heard about Elisha's miracles. He had even raised the dead. I knew Elisha could cure him, and Jehovah gave me the courage to speak up.
Despite being away from her parents, this little girl exercised strong faith.
We're watching Harold Corkern, who is a helper to the publishing committee. He's taking us through the symposium item, Imitate Women of Strong Faith, the Captive Israelite Girl. He's relating the story of a girl taken captive by a Syrian named Naaman, and the story goes that the girl recommended a prophet who could fix Naaman, and that's what ended up happening, but it demonstrated strong faith on the part of the girl that she was able to do that. And I just found it interesting that Harold Corkern prefaces this story by essentially talking about the depravity, the barbarity of this practice of taking away slaves, specifically ripping young girls from their families. He says,
On one of their raids, the Syrians had taken captive from the land of Israel a little girl who became a servant to Naaman's wife. Can you picture this little girl being ripped away from her parents? It was frightening for her.
I don't think frightening quite does it justice. I think terrified would be more accurate. It's interesting how he sort of glosses over the real permutations of what would have been involved in essentially taking girls when a victorious army plunders the defeated people of its girls. Surely they have one thing in mind, something that Harold Corkern doesn't apparently want to talk about. Apparently foremost on the mind of this girl would have been the prospect of her having to worship other gods.
She was taken to a strange land with people that were intimidating, and they worshiped many false gods.
Again, I think that would have been the least of her troubles. I think the fact that there was plurality of worship and people worshipping many different gods in the land to which she was being taken would have been way down on the pecking order for a young girl ripped from her family who would have had at least some interest in protecting her. She was now without protection. She was at the mercy of, let's face it, the men who had ripped her from her family. And it doesn't take much imagination to see what their motives might have been in selecting a girl in particular. And what's interesting is Harold Corkern tells this story as though, oh, look at what the depraved Syrians were doing, implying that the Israelites would have done no such thing when they were victorious over other armies. But what do we find in Numbers chapter 30, actually 31, if I read from verse 14, and I thought I'd read directly from the pages of the Silver Sword. Numbers 31, verse 14, but Moses grew indignant at the appointed men of the combat forces, the chiefs of the thousands and the chiefs of the hundreds who were coming in from the military expedition. Moses said to them, have you preserved all the females alive? Look, they are the ones who by Balaam's word induced the Israelites to commit unfaithfulness toward Jehovah over the affair of Peor, so that the scourge came upon the assembly of Jehovah. Now you should kill every male among the children and kill every woman who has had sexual relations with a man, but you may keep alive all the young girls who have not had sexual relations with a man. Now, the way this is worded, it's possible that a Jehovah's Witness reading this could think or say, well, what's happening here is the Israelite soldiers are killing everybody, but leaving girls who haven't had sex or who aren't old enough yet to have sex with a man, as though they're just leaving them on the battlefield or leaving them in the smouldering remains of this village that the Israelite soldiers have just plundered and killed everyone, as though the girls are just stood there next to their families who've just been butchered and just left there to fend for themselves. That's the image that you could be left with if you were being very generous in your reading of this verse. But what's interesting is this is one of several examples of where the translators or the creators of the New World Translation have watered down the text. When you read the same verse in other Bibles, it's more obvious what happened and it makes a lot more sense. So if I go online and I immediately compare other renderings from other translations of Numbers 31 verse 18, it says, New International Version, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Save for yourselves. So they're not just leaving the girl stood there in the smouldering ruins of their house next to their butchered family. They're grabbing the girl and they're bringing the girl with them, like the Syrians did. New Living Translation, only the young girls who are virgins may live. You may keep them for yourselves. English Standard Version, but all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. King James Bible, but all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. New American Standard Bible, however, all the girls who have not known a man intimately, keep alive for yourselves, and so on. So it's obvious what's happened here. The people who've compiled the New World Translation know how bad this looks because it's terrible, it's immoral, and rather than try to make any excuses for the Bible, they've simply changed it. Whereas all of the other Bibles tell it like it is. Obviously, you're not going to just leave a girl whose family have just been murdered standing there in the smouldering ruins. They're going to be taken along. And in fact, this was a specific command given to the soldiers of Israel. Don't just take them, but take them for yourselves. And again, I don't think it requires too much imagination as to what for yourselves might mean. So I'm confused as to how Harold Corkern, and maybe he just doesn't know his Bible, quite frankly, which is quite plausible, isn't it? But isn't it weird how Harold Corkern can say what he says about the Syrian soldiers as though, oh, well, this is an example of barbarous people. There's no way the Israelites would do this. Actually, it turns out the Israelites were commanded to do this when they were battling the Midianites by God through his representative, Moses.